we can't view it that way. We have to view it according to how much methane is coming from animal agriculture, how much nitrous oxide is coming from the fertilizers to grow the corn, to be fed to the cows, how many trees have been cut down that would have been sequestering carbon dioxide, what we call carbon opportunity cost, how much soil has been degraded that would have been richer soil if there were trees on the soil. And when you add all that up, you see that animal agriculture is most of the problem.
And as far as deforestation, is that simple, that they just cut it down trees because they need more land? That's just simple. And then when they cut, and what's wrong with cutting down a tree? It's no longer there to absorb carbon emissions. Is that the problem?
Yeah, actually, if I could step in there, I've spent many years wandering the bush looking at deforestation, and now several years researching it. And the thing with deforestation, what's fascinating is that each year the carbon dioxide we emit from fossil fuels, about half of it is taken up by the intact forests, the forests that are left alone. That's an enormous amount of carbon dioxide. So what's happened is that you've had this carbon dioxide fertilization effect, and the trees have been doing their best. Nature has been working so hard to soak up the excess carbon dioxide that we put in the air. But when we deforest, well, it's trickery in the accounting system. You see, the generally accepted way that the IPCC or that the world does carbon accounting is that they use gross emissions when it suits them, and they use net emissions when it suits them. And deforestation is one of those net emission factors. What happens is that they look at the land that's not untouched, they look at the managed land, and they say, here's the emissions from that managed land. And it comes down to deforestation, it comes down to fires and a few other things. But what they're doing is they're hiding the bulk of the emissions from deforestation by doing that, because the rest of the vegetation, that's so-called managed land, is soaking that up big time. So the emissions from deforestation are actually about 3 or 4 times more than the emissions that we generally agree in the IPCC accounts. And this is trickery of a large scale. And I'll show you, I'll just talk about another bit of trickery. Something you mentioned earlier, Glenn, cars versus cows. Well, actually, I should step back just a minute, if I can, you'll indulge me. We finished eating our way to extinction about 3 years ago, basically. And at that time, we had the best science, and we talked about this before, the 14.5% that animals contribute to climate change. That was the best that could be done, and we couldn't argue more than that at that time. But there's been a revolution in the science over that time. And one example of this, it gets back to Glenn. Last year, a paper was produced in PNAS, Dreyfus and others, and it looked at this accounting trickery in terms of fossil fuels. And what it found was that when we burn fossil fuels, we release carbon dioxide, it warms the planet. We also release sulfur dioxides and nitrogen oxides, which cool the planet. It's called global dimming. If you've ever been to a big industrial city, you see it as the grey smog, the white smog. It's everywhere. Asian cities exhibit it greatly. So this has been cooling the planet, and the amount of cooling is so strong that it's almost balanced the warming from carbon dioxide. So when you look at the net warming from fossil fuels, you find that it's been just 20% of the global warming that we have now. And that the biggest factor in global warming that we have now is from methane. Methane has caused half the global warming, just over half a degree by itself. And most of that 20% from fossil fuels is actually the methane component of fossil fuels. So this counting trickery has so misled us. If you look at deforestation, getting back to your point, deforestation emissions going way, way, way back in deep history, deforestation emissions have always been greater than fossil fuel. And fossil fuel comes with this cooling effect as well. So the big changes that we've seen on planet Earth have been due to deforestation that doesn't carry this burden of cooling and methane. So apart from the opportunity cost that we're talking about, with devoting that land back to nature to draw down, apart from that, the impact of animal agriculture is way more than the official figures suggest. So, you know, the science community, I'm looking at myself, and also generally the politicians, the climate scientists have got to recognise that we've been kidding ourselves, that emissions are way different to what we expect. Sorry, I've taken the floor for too long. I'll hand it back.
What's the summation of what percent of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from animal agriculture, your best estimate?
Oh, my best estimate? I, like everyone else, looked at Sailesh Rao's figure of 87% a couple of years ago, and I was scratching my head. At that time, I've moved on a lot, but at that time, I thought, this is ridiculous. How could that possibly be true? So I ran the sums. This is why I did the explanatory series of short videos on YouTube, and the sums are quite amazing. You see, that 87% figure is based on earlier work by Goodland and Anhang that had two very controversial elements in it. First of all, they considered that the breath, the respiration from cattle, is an emission. That was poo-pooed. And then they considered that methane should be accounted for over 20 years, not 100. And that was roundly criticised. So if you take out those two factors, what you're left with is, and you include the new data that we have now on, if you repurpose that land, rewild that land, how much will it draw down? If you include that as an emission in the calculation, it comes out at 87%. And it doesn't matter whether you account for methane over 20 years or 100 years. In the sums, it comes out as 87%, even though the total changes. So now I'm fully believing that, and see that net accounting for deforestation that I was talking about before, that's not even part of that measurement. And most, as we know, most deforestation is for agriculture and animal agriculture. So when you include that, when you include the other things like the fire emissions, you see, we burn the world every year, and that releases volatile organic compounds, it releases methane, it releases all sorts of nasties that turn into other things like tropospheric ozone, which we don't even count, which is a big greenhouse gas. So there's all these other factors that aren't counted above the 87%. So if you step back one moment and you look at planet Earth and you say, how do we manage our Earth? How do we manage our little planet, blue planet? And George Monbiot's book, I've just finished reading it, brilliant book. He says that if aliens were to visit the UK, they would think that the dominant life form was sheep. And that says it all. Globally, it's beef, it's cattle. But we give so much of our land, so much of our most precious resource to animals that we are preventing that land by burning it and by grazing it. We're stopping the trees coming back. We're preventing it from nature coming back and soaking down all that carbon dioxide, which is itching to do. It's really keen to do this, but it can't because we're preventing it. So if you look at those factors, I believe now that that climate change is almost totally caused by deforestation and methane, those sort of emissions. So 87%, I also concur with Salish Rao, is, I think, a low estimate of the impact of animal agriculture.
Let me jump in with an anecdote there about a conversation I had with Silas. I said, Silas, you were being conservative with this estimate because you didn't include the exhalations of 25 billion farmed animals in his calculations. He also didn't include many other factors simply because they're impossible to measure. Gerard mentioned the pasture maintenance fires that are set around the world. So everything that the cows don't eat gets burned. The trees, the bushes that grow on the grazing land annually get burned. Nobody's measuring how much in the way of greenhouse gases goes into the atmosphere from pasture maintenance fires around the world. He also didn't include, because I don't think there's any way to measure it, the bottom trawling of the ocean by industrial fishing and how much carbon gets kicked up into the ocean by bottom trawling of the ocean and how much that reduces the carbon capture of the ocean. He didn't include, because how do you measure it, the loss of sea forests and phytoplankton populations, again, caused by industrial fishing. So I said, Silas, do you have any back of the envelope estimate, if you included all those factors, how much of greenhouse gases could really be attributed to animal agriculture? And he said, Glenn, it might be 125%. And I laughed, because how could it be more than 100%? But he was right, because if you think about it, what we need to do is get to drawdown. And to get to drawdown, you need to reduce greenhouse gases by more than 100%. If we get to 100%, we're just staying stable. We need to draw down. And indeed, it could be that animal agriculture is responsible for more than the amount of our annual emissions when you factor in carbon opportunity costs, that we could be drawing it down.
Well, if we did that, if we didn't have any animal agriculture, what would they have to switch to? Because you wouldn't want to switch to something else that also had a big cost on the environment. So when you talk about switching away from animal agriculture, what would be ideal for them to switch to so that that new thing didn't also have a negative impact?
Well, I would speak to that and say that anytime you move up the food chain, you have profound inefficiencies. I mean, it's just a fact that it takes a certain amount of biomass to produce flesh or milk or eggs from an animal. And it's always inefficient because a lot of that biomass, whether it's corn or soy or grass, is going to turn into hoof and hide and bones and feathers and feces and body heat and energy the animal uses to move around. So it's kind of like a protein factory in reverse. So anything plant-based that is at the bottom of the food chain is going to be more efficient than anything animal-based, ultimately. That said, absolutely, some crops are more sustainable. Some crops use more water or less water. Some crops are better on the soil. Some, lentils, all of the legumes and pulses are particularly beneficial from an environmental standpoint. They fix nitrogen, they're high in protein, they're super nutritious. If you look at the blue zones where people traditionally have lived the longest healthy lives, legumes is one food that they consume in all of them. So, I think that's a great start, just beans for beef, right? And then we've got all the plant-based burgers and the, fake meat sort of things and plant milks and all that. And, the devil's in the details. You can make plants into all kinds of different products in a factory. And I think environmentally speaking, all those plant-based products are a huge step forward. Obviously, no animals are killed in the production of them. So there's ethical considerations there. From a health perspective, it's arguable. It depends, probably they're somewhat healthier, lower in saturated fat and whatnot, but they're not, hyper-processed foods are not what we need to gravitate towards from a health perspective. From an environmental perspective, I think the planet just wants us to stop eating animals.